The streetlight outside her apartment window painted skeletal shadows across the walls, but Maya Torres barely noticed them anymore. At 2 in the morning, her neighborhood was a graveyard of ambition, where mid-level systems analysts came home from late shifts and collapsed into dreamless sleep. She had been one of them until 3 months ago, until that transmission arrived on her workstation screen during the graveyard shift at Aerodyne Systems. Now, as she fumbled for her keys with trembling fingers, her breath coming in ragged gasps, Maya understood that everything she thought she knew about her quiet, suffocating existence had been a lie. Desk drawers lay scattered, their contents ransacked with surgical precision. Her workstation, the expensive dual-monitor setup she had saved 8 months to afford, was shattered. Glass shards glittered in the faint amber glow filtering through the half-drawn blinds. The smell hit her next, an intrusion that made her stomach tighten. Stale sweat and something chemical, sharp and wrong. They had been here recently. The air itself felt violated. Maya's hand instinctively went to her chest, where a single folded sheet of paper rested against her racing heart. She had printed it at a FedEx office 3 hours ago, just before her bank accounts froze. The screenshot showed what she had discovered buried in the transmission's metadata: Sumerian symbols overlaid with Tesla patent diagrams, geometric patterns that matched cuneiform tablets dated to 2400 BCE. The same patterns that appeared in declassified Project Blue book files from 1952. This piece of paper was the only evidence that existed outside the digital realm, the only proof that hadn't been systematically erased by whatever organization was now hunting her. Your corporate credentials have been revoked. Authentication failed. Account locked. Her banking app was next. Your account access has been temporarily suspended. Please contact customer service. Email. Password incorrect. She tried the recovery option. No account found with this address. Every footprint, every connection, every proof that Maya Torres existed in the modern world was being systematically severed. He was here last Tuesday. The walls of her apartment seemed to press inward, the skeletal shadows reaching for her like fingers. The voice in her head, the one that had kept her sane through years of soul-crushing routine, started its familiar litany: run, hide, disappear, become invisible again. Maybe they would lose interest if she became small enough, quiet enough, if she crawled back into the suffocating mundanity she had been trying to escape. But that was the lie she had been telling herself for 32 years. The lie that safety came from invisibility, that meaning could wait until tomorrow. Maya had spent her entire adult life as background noise in other people's stories. She had accepted the mechanical existence, the purposeless routine, because questioning it required courage she told herself she didn't have. The transmission had changed that. For the first time in her life, Maya Torres mattered. Someone had chosen her to receive that message. Whether it was the aliens themselves or some elaborate test, it didn't matter. She had been selected, and that selection meant something. The geometric patterns stared back at her, ancient symbols that had been carved into clay tablets 4,000 years before the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk. The same symbols that appeared in Nikola Tesla's personal notes about wireless energy transmission. The same symbols embedded in the alien contact's final message: they are watching you now. The go bag sat in her bedroom closet, exactly where she had left it 3 weeks ago when paranoia had first started creeping into her thoughts. Maya grabbed it without hesitation. $2,000 in cash, 3 burner phones still in their packaging, and a USB drive encrypted with 6 months of evidence, screenshots, audio files, network logs, everything she had meticulously compiled since that first transmission. The organization might have erased her digital footprint, but they hadn't found this, not yet. Not with violence, but with the only weapon that mattered in the age of information: exposure. If she could force the truth into the open, blast it across enough channels that it couldn't be contained, they couldn't erase her. The organization, whoever they were, operated in darkness. They relied on isolation and silence. 7 years of coming home exhausted, microwaving dinner, falling asleep to streaming shows she barely watched. It had been a half-life, a waiting room where she told herself meaning would arrive tomorrow. The only real thing she had done in those 7 years was say yes when that transmission appeared on her screen at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. She had responded when anyone with common sense would have reported it to their supervisor. She had followed the breadcrumbs, decoded the patterns, and allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had been chosen for something that mattered. Because someone had been waiting for a person curious enough, isolated enough, desperate enough to follow where it led. Because Maya Torres, mid-level systems analyst with an obsessive need for answers and no one to talk her out of stupid decisions, was exactly the kind of person they could either control or eliminate. 2 weeks before her life collapsed, Maya Torres sat in the vast emptiness of the Aerodyne System's 4th floor, surrounded by the mechanical hum of servers and the phosphorescent glow of monitoring screens. It was 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, that dead hour when the world outside ceased to matter and time became something elastic and strange. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows that lined the eastern wall of the system's analysis bay, she could see the SpaceX facility across the industrial park, its rockets standing like chrome sentinels against the bruised California sky. Those towers represented futures that belonged to other people, dreams that required the kind of audacity Maya had lost somewhere between her MIT graduation and her 32nd birthday. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their endless monotone song, a sound that had become the soundtrack to her existence. Maya was the only person on the entire floor, possibly in the entire building. The graveyard shift was her domain, the kingdom she had claimed not through ambition, but through attrition. Day shift required small talk, staff meetings, the exhausting performance of normalcy. Night shift required only competence and the ability to stay awake. She had both in abundance, along with a graduate degree in signal processing that was gathering dust in some digital repository while she babysat automated satellite uplinks. Her job was to watch for anomalies, flag suspicious patterns, and maintain system integrity. It was work that required perhaps 10% of her attention, which left the other 90% free to contemplate the existential question that had been haunting her with increasing urgency. When exactly did I become a ghost in my own life? Maya didn't taste it anymore. She didn't taste much of anything these days. She toggled between monitoring dashboards with mechanical efficiency, her fingers moving across the keyboard in patterns she could execute in her sleep. Probably had executed in her sleep, given how little difference there was between her waking hours and her dreams. Both featured the same empty spaces, the same absence of human warmth, the same creeping sense that she had somehow missed the moment when life was supposed to begin. Her hair was pulled back in a functional ponytail, the same style she had worn since graduate school, because changing it required a level of self-care she couldn't seem to access anymore. She looked like what she was, competent, forgettable, slowly disappearing into the background noise of her own existence. A dying succulent sat in a cheap ceramic pot near her keyboard, its leaves brown at the edges, despite her sporadic attempts at watering. Next to it stood a framed photograph from MIT, 5 years old now, showing a version of herself she barely recognized. That Maya was grinning widely, surrounded by classmates at some end-of-semester party, her eyes bright with the certainty that her future would be extraordinary. She hadn't spoken to any of those people in years. Their names appeared occasionally in her LinkedIn feed, announcing promotions and awards and startups. She never clicked the congratulate button. What he got was a woman who increasingly retreated into work, into silence, into the safe predictability of isolation. When he finally left, taking the furniture and the social circle and the obligation to engage with the world, Maya had felt something uncomfortably close to relief. She declined them all with increasingly transparent excuses until people stopped asking. Her last meaningful conversation with another human being had been 3 months ago when a grocery store cashier asked how her day was going. And Maya had found herself answering honestly for reasons she couldn't explain. "Empty," she had said, and the poor woman's smile had frozen on her face, unsure if this was humor or a cry for help. Maya had paid for her groceries and left before the question could be answered. The quiet was predictable, controllable, a world she could navigate without risk, until tonight. Protocol was clear: flag it immediately for security review, quarantine the data stream, file an incident report, standard operating procedure for potential industrial espionage or foreign intelligence gathering. Most unauthorized transmissions were crude, opportunistic attempts to siphon data through existing channels. They had the digital signature of smash-and-grab operations. This was different. The waveform was too structured, too deliberate, too impossibly precise. It looked less like hacking and more like something that had been waiting for her specifically to notice it. Her heart rate kicked up, a sensation so unfamiliar that it took her a moment to identify it as excitement. When was the last time she had felt curious about something at work? When had routine last been interrupted by genuine mystery? Maya glanced over her shoulder at the empty floor, a habitual check even though she knew she was alone. The monitoring software would log her actions, but there was enough ambiguity in the protocols that she could justify a preliminary analysis before escalating. At least, that's what she told herself as she routed the signal to her isolated workstation, bypassing the automatic logging system. She had presented it as a security feature during a quarterly review, and management had approved it with the kind of distracted nod that suggested they hadn't really been listening. Now Maya activated it, channeling the unknown transmission into a quarantined space where she could examine it without triggering every alarm in the building. An audio file, heavily compressed and layered with encryption she had never seen before. Maya's hands moved across the keyboard with the muscle memory of a concert pianist, her fingers flying through decryption algorithms and signal processing filters. This was what she had been trained to do, what she was actually brilliant at when given something worthy of her attention. The digital fog began to clear, revealing the structure underneath. She hesitated for just a moment before putting on her headphones. This was the point of no return, the moment when curiosity crossed into something that protocol would definitively label as violation. If this was a security test, she was failing spectacularly. If it was actual espionage, she was about to compromise herself. But Maya's fatal flaw had always been her need for answers, the obsessive drive that overrode self-preservation and common sense. Her loneliness made her vulnerable to believing that maybe this once she was special, that maybe this message was meant specifically for her. Harmonic frequencies layered over each other in patterns that shouldn't work together but somehow did, creating a sound that felt ancient and impossibly precise. And then, cutting through the harmonic landscape like a blade through silk, came a voice. It was a voice that understood English, the way a linguist understands a dead language, perfectly, but without native intuition. The words themselves were clear enough to make Maya's blood run cold. It had called her specifically. In the vast digital network of Aerodyne systems, with thousands of employees and millions of data points, this transmission had found her workstation during her shift at the exact moment she would be alone and curious enough to listen. The statistical improbability of that was staggering, unless it wasn't improbability at all, unless she really had been selected. Ancient Sumerian mythology, gods who supposedly descended from the heavens and gave humanity civilization, agriculture, written language. She had done a paper on comparative mythology in undergrad, remembered the theories that the Anunnaki were actually ancient astronauts, Fringe science, the kind of thing that got you laughed out of academic circles. Except now that fringe science was speaking her name through encrypted channels and claiming responsibility for engineering one of the most influential humans alive. Whether it was real or elaborate hoax or psychological test, someone had looked at her specifically and decided she mattered. For a woman who had become background noise in her own life, that was impossible to ignore. For the first time in years, she couldn't wait to see what happened next. The transmission continued playing on her isolated workstation, the voice speaking coordinates and patent numbers with that same alien cadence, now punctuated by phrases in a language that sounded harsh and ancient. Sumerian, maybe. She had taken a semester of comparative linguistics in undergrad and remembered the distinctive phonetic patterns. Her hands trembled as she reached for the keyboard, her rational mind screaming at her to shut it down, wipe the files, pretend this never happened. If this was monitored, if security was watching, she had just created permanent evidence of protocol violation. The rational part of her brain, the part that had kept her safe and invisible for 5 years, was screaming a litany of reasonable explanations. Elaborate corporate hack, industrial espionage from a rival aerospace company, maybe even a sophisticated prank from a disgruntled engineer with too much time and technical skill. Any of those explanations made infinitely more sense than what the voice was claiming. The first relay was a commercial communications satellite in geosynchronous orbit. The second was a military reconnaissance platform that should have rejected unauthorized traffic. The third was a deep space monitoring array operated by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And before that, nothing. The signal's origin point simply didn't exist. It appeared in the network like spontaneous generation, materializing without source or explanation. The words formed in her mind, and Maya felt her coffee-soaked stomach twist. She ran the trace again, checking for errors in her analysis. The result was identical. The transmission had come from nowhere, or from somewhere so far outside normal operational parameters that her systems couldn't even classify it as anomalous. It simply registered as impossible. Maya had analyzed signal security for 7 years, had worked on classified military communications protocols, had even consulted on NASA's Deep Space Network during her graduate research. She knew the current state of the art in encryption technology. This was quantum-level security, possibly even beyond that. The computational power required to generate these encryption keys would require hardware that didn't exist outside of theoretical physics papers. This was decades beyond current technology, maybe centuries. If humans had created this, they were using tools that defied her entire understanding of information security. Voice synthesis created harmonic patterns that didn't quite match human vocal production. Pitch correction, time stretching, any form of audio editing would show up under this level of scrutiny. She had used this same software to testify as an expert witness during her brief stint doing freelance security consulting. It was industry standard, trusted by courts and intelligence agencies. If this was a hoax, someone had created it using technology that was simultaneously crude enough to use audio files and sophisticated enough to leave no trace of manipulation. The contradiction made her head hurt, and more than any of that, more than the impossible signal source or the quantum encryption or the pristine audio, was the fact that the voice had said her name, Maya Torres, not recipient or user or any generic identifier, a specific name pronounced correctly with the slight emphasis on the second syllable that most people missed. Her laptop balanced precariously on the steering wheel, its screen casting blue light across her face. She looked like a ghost, she thought distantly, a ghost investigating her own haunting. Invented by Tesla Energy in 2006, the foundation of their lithium-ion battery technology. US 90659293B2 rocket propulsion system, SpaceX's proprietary reusable rocket engine, filed in 2012. She stared at the patent diagrams, trying to understand what the connection was supposed to be. They were significant technologies, certainly, revolutionary even, but why would ancient aliens care about battery management and rocket propulsion? The thought made Maya's skin prickle. She pulled up the archaeological databases she had access to through her university alumni credentials, searching for Sumerian geometric patterns. The British Museum had an extensive digitized collection of Mesopotamian artifacts. She entered search parameters for clay tablets dated between 2500 and 2000 BCE, filtering for geometric or mathematical content. The database returned 47 results. Maya started opening them one by one, comparing the carved patterns to the patent diagrams on her other screen. Maya placed it side by side with the circuit diagram from Tesla's battery patent. The lattice pattern from the clay tablet was identical to the electron flow management system in the lithium-ion design. Not similar, not reminiscent, identical. The same number of nodes, the same intersection angles, the same topological structure. Of course, some of them would resemble modern circuit diagrams by pure chance. She ran a correlation analysis, feeding both images into pattern recognition software. The algorithm calculated geometric similarity across multiple parameters: angle deviation, node placement, structural symmetry. The result appeared on her screen in clinical precision, 97.3% correlation. She tried a third time, adjusting the parameters to be more stringent, 96.8%. The slight variation was within normal statistical noise. The patterns were, for all practical purposes, identical. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but when she took a drink anyway, it tasted like metal, like her mouth had filled with the taste of fear or revelation or something that didn't have a name yet. The question formed in her mind, dangerous and seductive: what if I'm the only person who knows this? The transmission had come to her specifically. The voice had said she was selected as receptor. If this was real, if any of this was actually real, then she was sitting in her car in a parking lot in Hawthorne, California, holding evidence that would rewrite human history. And if it wasn't real, if this was some kind of test or trap or elaborate psychological operation, then she was already in danger for having discovered it. Either way, she couldn't unknow what she now knew. The ordinary world, the safe mundanity of her ghost existence, was already gone. She just hadn't accepted it yet. She had spent those 3 days barely sleeping, analyzing the transmission from every angle she could think of, downloading her findings to encrypted drives, and trying to determine if she was experiencing a psychotic break or actual contact with something beyond human understanding. Marcus was her only quasi-friend at Aerodyne, though friend was probably too strong a word. They had worked together on a satellite uplink project 2 years ago, discovered they both liked the same obscure science fiction novels, and had maintained a cordial relationship based primarily on occasional lunch conversations about astronomy and speculative physics. He was a senior trajectory analyst, worked on classified military satellite deployments, and had the kind of access to restricted databases that Maya's mid-level credentials couldn't touch. If anyone could verify what she had found, it was him. It was a warm November day, unusually clear, the kind of California weather that made people in other states hate California. Marcus was eating a sandwich from the company cafeteria, looking relaxed and entirely unprepared for what Maya was about to show him. Maya kept her voice low, hyper-aware of security cameras and the possibility of directional microphones, as she gave him the summary: unauthorized transmission, impossible origin point, Sumerian connections, patent correlations. She watched his expression go from curiosity to concern to the carefully neutral face people made when they thought they were dealing with someone unstable. When she pulled out her personal tablet and showed him the encrypted files, His eyes flickered with something that might have been professional interest, or might have been alarm. She had pulled classified SpaceX launch vectors from restricted databases, overlaying them with the coordinates mentioned in the transmission. It was a terminable offense, just having those files on a personal device. Marcus's pupils dilated as he processed what he was seeing, and Maya knew she had him. He pulled out his phone, opening what looked like a commercial star mapping application, but was actually a classified trajectory analysis tool that Marcus had shown her once during a long night shift. He entered the coordinates, cross-referencing them with another database that Maya couldn't identify. His fingers moved quickly, professionally, the skepticism on his face slowly transforming into something else. Something that looked uncomfortably like fear. "These launch trajectories," Marcus said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "they're not optimized for orbital mechanics. Standard SpaceX launches follow minimum energy transfer orbits to maximize payload efficiency. They're wasting delta V, burning extra fuel for inclination changes that don't make sense from an engineering standpoint. They align with Sumerian sacred sites," Marcus continued, his voice gone flat with shock. "Babylon, Eridu, Uruk, the trajectory vectors, if you project them down to ground level instead of treating them as pure orbital paths, they intersect at ancient temple complexes. The launch azimuths are wrong for optimal Earth rotation advantage, but they're perfect for what? Marking out ancient sites from orbit? That's insane. That's not how rocket science works. But I can't delete it, because if this is real, Marcus, if any part of this is real, the kind of people who would want this buried don't send warning letters." When it began to emit the startup chime, Maya's chopsticks clattered to the floor. "The Watchers have detected your inquiry. Acceleration is necessary. Download the activation sequence. Cease investigation. You are being monitored. This is your only warning." She was almost certain it hadn't been there an hour ago when she had ordered her food delivery. Maybe she was being paranoid. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe it meant nothing. Whoever was monitoring her would see what she did next, would know that she was refusing their warning. This was the moment where she could still back away, could delete everything and pretend to comply. She could go back to being a ghost, invisible and safe. She was no longer observing the mystery from a safe distance. She was inside it now, complicit and committed. The ordinary world, with its predictable routines and its suffocating mundanity, was gone. The threshold had been crossed. There was no going back to the person she had been 2 weeks ago, sitting alone in that systems analysis bay, wondering when her life would begin. The diner in El Segundo was the kind of place that existed in a permanent state of 3 a.m., even when the sun was shining outside. Cracked vinyl booths, fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical interference, and a waitress who looked like she had given up judging her customers sometime during the Reagan administration. Maya and Marcus had claimed the corner booth, the one with a direct sightline to both entrances and the parking lot beyond the grimy windows. Their laptops were open, screens angled away from casual observation, power cables snaking across the laminate table to a wall outlet they had tested for tampering before plugging in. They had been awake for 36 hours straight, fueled by paranoia and black coffee that tasted like it had been brewed with resentment and old grounds. He was using his NSA-level credentials, the kind of access that came with background checks and polygraph tests, and the implicit understanding that misuse carried federal prison sentences. They were so far past career termination at this point that Maya had stopped thinking about consequences in conventional terms. Either they would uncover something significant enough to justify the violations, or they would disappear like Daniel Reeves had disappeared. There didn't seem to be much middle ground. Then the R&D archives, the bleeding edge of aerospace technology, where billions of dollars in development costs were encoded in technical specifications and patent applications. The data was staggering in its scope, but more than that, it was staggering in its implications. The official story was well known, repeated in countless interviews and biographies. Child prodigy in South Africa, moved to Canada, transferred to University of Pennsylvania, dropped out of Stanford to found Zip2, sold it for millions, co-founded PayPal, sold that for billions, then pivoted into aerospace and electric vehicles. The narrative arc of a self-made visionary, pulling himself up through intelligence and relentless work ethic. It was inspirational. It was American mythology at its finest. And according to the raw data in front of her, it contained statistical impossibilities. They had provided the seed funding that kept Zip2 alive during its critical early phase. And after the acquisition by Compaq in 1999, all three of them vanished from public records. No subsequent investments, no advisory positions, no trace of them in any financial database. They had appeared, funded exactly one company, and then ceased to exist as economic entities. Could be shell companies, he offered, but his voice lacked conviction. Offshore money, tax avoidance, the usual Silicon Valley tricks. And when I checked the GPS coordinates for the convention center against astronomical databases, the chance encounter with Tesla founders Martin Eberhard and Mark Tarpenning followed the same pattern. The official story placed it at a private event in Los Angeles in 2003. The actual GPS coordinates, extracted from photo metadata and cell tower triangulation, corresponded to a location that aligned with the ancient temple of Inanna in Uruk. The meeting that led to Musk funding and eventually taking over Tesla had occurred at a specific point on Earth's surface that was astronomically significant to Sumerian religion 4,000 years ago. The Tesla Roadster unveiling, winter solstice, 2006, Neuralink announcement, vernal equinox, 2017, each one aligned with dates that were significant in Sumerian astronomical observation. The Mesopotamians had been obsessive about tracking celestial events, building their religious calendar around solstices and equinoxes and specific planetary alignments. And Elon Musk's entire career, whether through conscious design or impossible coincidence, followed that same ancient calendar. Except here was the data, laid out in spreadsheets and timeline visualizations showing exactly that pattern. The implications sprawled out like fractal branches, each one more disturbing than the last. She would enter the building, and the camera would swivel to follow her path to the elevator. It was a pan-tilt zoom model, expensive hardware that the building management had installed after a break-in 3 years ago. It should have been operating on motion detection software that triggered recording, but not active tracking. Someone had changed the programming. Someone was watching her in real time. Never the same vehicle twice, which was professional tradecraft. First, a grey Honda Civic, maintaining 3 car lengths behind her on the drive to Whole Foods. Then, a black Ford Explorer when she drove to the FedEx office to make copies of her evidence. A white Toyota Camry followed her to the diner where she met Marcus. The vehicles rotated, but the pattern was consistent. Someone was tracking her movements, and they wanted her to know it. Her phone calls developed an echo. Maya had done enough signals intelligence work to recognize the telltale sign of interception. When she called her mother in Phoenix, there was a half-second delay before her mother's voice came through, and underneath it, a faint digital artifact that sounded like her own words bouncing back at her. 3-way monitoring, the call being routed through an additional node for recording and analysis. The technology was military-grade, the kind of surveillance that required court orders or national security letters, or the kind that bypassed legal requirements entirely when the organization doing the monitoring didn't answer to civilian oversight. Projects she had worked on for months were reassigned without explanation. Her supervisor, a kind man named Robert, who had always been supportive, started avoiding eye contact in the hallways. Maya checked her security clearance status through the internal HR portal and found it flagged for routine review. Nothing specific, nothing she could challenge, just the slow, systematic isolation that preceded termination. or worse. He had found a GPS tracker attached to the underframe of his car, magnetic mount, hidden in the wheel well where it wouldn't be visible during normal operation. He showed it to Maya in the diner parking lot, the device sitting on the table between them like an accusation. It was commercial hardware, available on Amazon, but the SIM card inside was registered to a shell corporation with addresses in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. The surveillance was professional, methodical, and making no effort to hide itself. The message was clear: abandon this investigation, or escalate to the point where more direct action would be necessary. In her dreams, she would wake up in her apartment to find all evidence of her existence systematically removed. Her name deleted from databases, her colleagues claiming they had never heard of her, her mother answering the phone and asking who was calling. The erasure wasn't violent, it was bureaucratic, methodical, the kind of deletion that happened in server logs and personnel records. She would cease to exist, not through death, but through administrative action. But despite the fear, despite the surveillance and the nightmares, and the certain knowledge that she was being hunted, Maya couldn't stop. The evidence was mounting too fast, the patterns too compelling. She had spent 5 years as a ghost in her own life, going through the motions of existence without purpose or meaning. This investigation, dangerous as it was, had given her something she hadn't felt since graduate school: significance. The obsessive curiosity that was her fatal flaw overrode every self-preservation instinct. She needed answers more than she needed safety. The firewall protected archived Cold War documents, stored on legacy servers that were technically still classified but practically forgotten. Government bureaucracy had a way of losing track of its own secrets, especially when those secrets were 50 years old and stored on obsolete hardware that required specialized access protocols. The scanned files were degraded, showing the distinctive artifacts of having been digitized from physical documents that had spent decades in file cabinets. Water damage, fading ink, coffee stains, and cigarette burns all contributed to making portions of the text illegible, but enough remained readable to paint a picture that made Maya's hands shake as she scrolled through the pages. The program had been a collaboration between the CIA and Soviet KGB, one of those rare moments of cooperation between rival superpowers when something scared them both more than they scared each other. The subject of investigation: non-human technological intervention in human innovation. The hypothesis was laid out in bureaucratic language that couldn't quite hide the radical nature of what was being proposed. What if certain technological leaps throughout human history weren't the result of human genius, but rather the result of external guidance? What if advanced intelligence had been selecting and preparing certain individuals to receive and execute technological advancement? Nikola Tesla flagged as a potential receptor subject based on his own claims of receiving radio signals from extraterrestrial sources and his numerous technological breakthroughs that seemed to come to him fully formed. Thomas Edison, whose prolific invention record and specific focus on electrical systems matched the pattern of guided development. Werner von Braun, the Nazi rocket scientist who became the architect of the American space program, whose technical knowledge seemed to exceed what contemporary education and research could explain. Each one had been investigated, their biographies analyzed for signs of external influence, their psychological profiles examined for receptiveness to non-human contact. The researchers had identified specific markers: individuals who experienced periods of isolation followed by sudden breakthroughs, who reported receiving information through dreams or visions, who possessed technical knowledge that couldn't be fully explained by their education or experience, and who emerged at specific historical moments when humanity was ready for particular technological advances. The pattern suggested cultivation rather than invasion. Advanced intelligence didn't need to conquer humanity directly. It only needed to guide development, nudging human civilization along specific trajectories by positioning the right minds at the right moments, with the right insights. Recommend reclassification to myth containment. Translation: they hadn't found proof, but they had found enough to scare them into pretending they had never looked. The entire program was sealed, classified above top secret, and consigned to the kind of governmental forgetting that was more complete than any destruction of records. If Project Vessel's hypothesis was correct, then Elon Musk wasn't an outlier. He was the continuation of a pattern that stretched back through human history. The Anunnaki, if they were real, hadn't built pyramids or taught agriculture directly. They had prepared certain humans to do those things, positioning them in specific genetic, social, and intellectual intersections where they could receive and execute technological advancement. And that preparation was still ongoing, still selecting individuals who would push humanity towards some goal that the cultivators themselves had designed thousands of years ago. They had crossed another threshold, moved from investigating a possible hoax to uncovering evidence of something vast and coordinated and stretching back through decades of deliberate concealment. The surveillance watching them wasn't random corporate security. It was whatever organization had inherited Project Vessel's mission, still operating in the shadows, still working to contain knowledge that would shatter every assumption about human agency and progress. Maya saved the last photograph and powered down her phone, removing the battery as an additional precaution against tracking. They had the evidence now. The question was what to do with it, and whether they would survive long enough to decide. The parking lot was half empty. The lunch rush already faded, leaving behind only the regulars and the people who had nowhere better to be. She pulled into a space with a clear view of the entrance, a habit that had become second nature over the past weeks. Her eyes scanned the interior through the grimy windows, looking for Marcus's familiar silhouette in their corner booth. The booth was empty. She waited in her car for 10 minutes, telling herself he was just running late. Marcus was punctual to a fault, a consequence of years working in classified environments where tardiness could trigger security alerts. But maybe traffic was bad. Maybe he had gotten held up at work. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation that didn't involve the dark possibilities already forming in the back of her mind. At 15 minutes, Maya went inside and took their usual booth, ordering coffee she didn't want from the waitress, who had stopped learning their names weeks ago. His voice on the recording sounded normal, professional, completely at odds with the reality of his absence. She hung up without leaving a message and called again. Voicemail. She sent a text. "Where are you?" The message showed as delivered but not read. The double check marks that would indicate he had opened it never appeared. She left cash on the table, probably too much, but she couldn't focus enough to calculate the right amount, and drove to Marcus's apartment in Culver City. The building was a generic stucco complex from the 1980s, painted beige, because apparently Southern California had laws requiring a certain percentage of buildings to be aggressively bland. Marcus lived on the second floor, Unit 2D, a one-bedroom that he had furnished with the sparse functionality of someone who spent most of his waking hours at work. "I'm looking for Marcus Chen," Maya said, keeping her voice neutral. "Unit 2D, have you seen him today?" Marcus had lived in that apartment for 4 years. He had complained about the rent increases and the broken air conditioning and the neighbors who played music too loud on weekends. People didn't just abandon 4 years of their life overnight. Concern, fear, the hollow certainty that something terrible had happened. The apartment was cleaned out completely when I checked it. Professional job. Looked like no one had ever lived there. Kim was reluctant but eventually relented. Perhaps because Maya looked desperate enough to make a scene, perhaps because he was curious himself about a tenant who had vanished so thoroughly. He unlocked Unit 2D and pushed the door open, revealing an interior that made Maya's breath catch in her throat. The walls were bare, without even the small holes where Marcus had hung his framed degrees and his collection of vintage NASA posters. The carpet showed vacuum tracks, perfectly uniform, without the wear patterns that years of habitation would create. Maya walked through the space in a daze, opening closets that were empty, checking the bathroom where even the soap dispenser had been removed. The kitchen counters were spotless, the appliances gleaming, as if they had never been used. There wasn't even dust in the corners, those inevitable accumulations that proved a space was real and lived in, rather than a sterile display. Maya drove back to her own apartment in a fugue state, navigating traffic on autopilot while her mind tried to process what Marcus's disappearance meant. She finally reached his family through Facebook, finding his mother's profile after 20 minutes of searching. The woman who answered the phone had a voice that was carefully neutral, coached in the way that people sounded when they were reading from a script or repeating something they had been told to say. "Marcus is on extended personal leave," his mother said, the words coming out too smoothly, without the natural hesitation of spontaneous speech. "He's dealing with some private matters and requested that we not share his location. I'm sure he'll reach out to his friends when he's ready. Can you at least tell me if he's okay, if he's safe?" Maya stared at her phone, at the call log showing the conversation that had lasted less than 2 minutes, and felt the last vestiges of hope evaporate. The methodology was familiar now, the same systematic erasure that had almost claimed her before she had run. But Marcus's security clearance had been higher than hers, his access to classified systems more extensive. His value to any organization concerned with information security should have made him more protected, not more vulnerable. Unless that clearance was exactly why he had been targeted, unless knowing too much made him not an asset, but a liability. The organization hunting them had the resources and authority to erase a senior trajectory analyst with NSA-level credentials as thoroughly as they had erased a mid-level systems analyst who had gotten too curious. If they could make Marcus vanish, they could make anyone vanish. The conspiracy wasn't theoretical anymore, wasn't something she was investigating from a safe distance. It had teeth, and it had just shown her exactly how sharp they were. Completely, utterly alone, in a way that made her previous 5 years of isolation seem like a luxury of choice. The loneliness that had once been comfortable, that she had cultivated as protection against disappointment and engagement, now suffocated her. She checked her rear-view mirror compulsively during the drive home, looking for tales that were certainly there, but that she could never quite confirm. She slept with all the lights on in her apartment, though sleep was a generous term for the fitful hours of semi-consciousness punctuated by jolts of adrenaline at every random noise. The weight of being the only person who knew what she knew was crushing, and Maya understood for the first time why whistleblowers broke, why people under this kind of pressure sometimes just gave up and accepted whatever narrative they were offered in exchange for the surveillance stopping. The package arrived at her workplace 4 days after Marcus vanished. Maya had been avoiding the office as much as possible, taking sick days and remote work arrangements. But eventually she had to show up for a mandatory staff meeting or risk triggering additional scrutiny. The package was sitting on her desk when she arrived, a small brown box addressed to her personally with no return address. The mailing label was computer-printed, generic, the kind of anonymous shipping that could have come from anywhere. She opened it carefully, using scissors to cut the tape rather than tearing it, half expecting something terrible to be inside. Maya lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of it in her hands, the physical reality of something ancient and impossible sitting on her desk next to her computer and coffee mug. Underneath the tablet was a handwritten note on plain white paper. The letters formed in neat block capitals that gave no hint of the writer's identity. "Come alone." Someone else knew. Someone else believed her enough to send physical evidence that couldn't be digitally erased. The humans were shown in poses of learning or receiving, and what they were receiving looked disturbingly like technical knowledge. Cuneiform symbols that Maya recognized as the Sumerian words for lightning and fire were interspersed with diagrams that shouldn't exist in ancient art. Geometric patterns that looked less like decorative elements and more like circuit diagrams. Lines connecting nodes in configurations that resembled electrical schematics. It was impossible. It was insane. It was exactly what the Anunnaki transmission had claimed. When the results came back, the lab technician handed her a report with the kind of professional detachment that suggested he had seen stranger things and learned not to ask questions. The cuneiform script was period-appropriate, using grammatical structures and vocabulary that scholars had only fully decoded in the past 50 years. If this was a fake, it was the most sophisticated archaeological forgery ever created, requiring knowledge of ancient Sumerian language and clay composition that only a handful of specialists in the world possessed. Or it was exactly what it appeared to be. Physical evidence of technological knowledge existing 4,000 years before humanity should have possessed it. But when she overlaid archaeological survey maps, she found references to a site of pre-Columbian petroglyphs that mainstream academia largely ignored. The site had been documented in the 1970s, deemed interesting but not significant enough for major excavation, and then forgotten as funding and attention moved to more promising locations. It was exactly the kind of place where someone who didn't want to be found would operate. The drive to the Mojave took 4 hours, Maya's small sedan struggling on the unpaved access roads that led away from the highway into increasingly desolate terrain. The coordinates brought her to a cluster of rock formations, red sandstone worn into strange shapes by wind and time. Among the rocks, she found a research trailer that looked like it had been there for decades, solar panels on the roof, and a generator humming quietly in the shade. A pickup truck was parked nearby, covered in desert dust, and as Maya approached, the trailer door opened. Didn't ask for identification or explanation. She just stepped aside and gestured for Maya to enter the trailer, as if she had been expecting this visit for years. Archaeological sites, modern infrastructure, satellite imagery, astronomical charts, all layered together in a visual argument that would have seemed like conspiracy theorist madness, except that Maya recognized the methodology. This was research, systematic and rigorous, just pursued without institutional support or peer review. Dr. Kahali had been working alone, building her case piece by piece, while the academic establishment that had once employed her pretended she didn't exist. Presented evidence of electrical systems in Egyptian temples, magnetic anomalies at Mayan sites, crystalline structures in Mesopotamian artifacts that resembled modern semiconductors. The peer review was brutal. They called it pseudoscience, ancient aliens nonsense, career suicide. She smiled without humor. They were right about the career suicide part. The correlation was striking. Modern electric vehicle charging infrastructure aligned with locations that various ancient cultures had designated as sacred or powerful. The ancients weren't primitive, Dr. Kahal said, her voice carrying the fervor of someone who had been right for decades while the world called her crazy. They were receiving instructions. Look at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, 11,000 years old, built before agriculture, before written language. But the astronomical alignments are perfect. The engineering is sophisticated. How does a hunter-gatherer society build that? None of them know it. They think they're geniuses having original insights. Really, they're receptors, antenna tuned to frequencies that have been broadcasting for millennia, waiting for minds prepared to receive them. Patent analyses showing technological breakthroughs that appeared simultaneously in multiple unconnected minds. Biographical data on inventors who all reported similar experiences. Periods of isolation, sudden insights, knowledge that seemed to come from outside themselves. It's all here, now it's yours. But holding it, she also felt the weight of responsibility. Dr. Cahal had spent 2 decades in exile for pursuing this truth. Marcus had vanished. Daniel Reeves was gone. How many others had gotten close and been erased? And now that burden was hers. Because they're watching you, which means you're close to something real, and because sometimes the signal chooses who hears it. You were selected, Maya. Whether by aliens or algorithms or cosmic coincidence, you were chosen to receive this. The question is what you do with it now. Kahili's research copied to 3 separate encrypted drives and months of her own evidence compiled into a comprehensive document that laid out the entire conspiracy in methodical detail. For the first time in weeks, she felt something that approximated hope. The evidence was undeniable now, physical artifacts that couldn't be dismissed as digital manipulation. Academic research that, while suppressed, had been produced using rigorous methodology. The correlations were too strong, the patterns too consistent. She had enough to force the truth into the open, to make this story too big to contain. She would send it to journalists at major papers, to whistleblower networks like WikiLeaks, to congressional oversight committees that had jurisdiction over aerospace and defense. She would make multiple copies, distributed widely enough that suppressing all of them would be impossible. Once the information was public, the surveillance would stop. They couldn't erase her if everyone knew what she knew. The logic felt sound. Press conferences where she calmly presented the evidence. Academic experts forced to acknowledge the correlations. Maybe even Marcus reappearing once the conspiracy was exposed, released from whatever pressure had forced him into hiding. The vindication would be sweet, but more than that, it would mean her life had mattered, that she had been chosen for something significant, that the 5 years of ghost existence had been preparation for this moment. For the first time in nearly a month, Maya slept for 6 hours straight. No nightmares, no waking every hour to check the locks on her door, just deep, genuine sleep driven by exhaustion and the belief that she had finally found a way forward. It was the last peaceful sleep she would have. Because while she rested, secure in her false sense of progress, they made their move. And when she woke up, everything she thought she had accomplished would be revealed as illusion, and the real horror of her situation would finally become clear. Maya had spent 6 peaceful hours asleep, dreaming of vindication and press conferences, while trained operatives had systematically destroyed everything she had worked for. She stumbled through her apartment door at 2 in the morning, breath ragged from running up 4 flights of stairs because the elevator felt like a trap, fingers trembling as she fumbled for the light switch. When the living room exploded into view under the harsh overhead lighting, the scope of the violation hit her like a physical blow. Her workstation, the elaborate multi-monitor setup that represented years of careful upgrades and personal investment, was completely destroyed. The screens were shattered, spiderwebs of cracks radiating from impact points. The tower case had been pried open, the hard drives removed and presumably taken or destroyed. Faint streetlight filtered through the half-drawn blinds, casting skeletal shadows across the wreckage, making the destruction look even more apocalyptic. Maya moved through the apartment in a daze, cataloguing the losses. Every external hard drive was gone, the shelf where she had kept her backup storage now empty, except for dust patterns showing where the drives had been. Every paper file, including her printed analyses and the notes she had handwritten when paranoia about digital surveillance became overwhelming, had vanished. The filing cabinet in her bedroom stood open and empty, not a single document remaining. They had been thorough, professional, taking the time to ensure that nothing remained of her investigation. Kahili's USB drive, containing 20 years of suppressed research, was shattered. Maya found the pieces on her desk, the plastic housing broken open, the circuit board inside snapped cleanly in half. Months of work, thousands of hours of investigation and analysis and careful evidence compilation, erased in a single night while she slept. The single sheet of paper, showing Sumerian symbols overlaid with Tesla patent diagrams, the first piece of evidence she had printed, had survived only because her paranoia had reached the level where she carried critical documents on her person at all times. Everything else was gone. They had been allowing her to compile evidence, watching her gather materials and make connections and reach out to collaborators so they could identify every leak in their containment system. Every copy of the data she had made, every person she had contacted, every location she had visited, all of it had been monitored, catalogued, and now systematically eliminated. She had thought she was hunting the truth. Really? She had been the bait, drawing out anyone else who might threaten the conspiracy's secrecy. Your account access has been temporarily suspended. Email. Password incorrect. The digital erasure was beginning, the same methodical destruction that had preceded Marcus's disappearance. Her entire identity was being systematically deleted, and based on the timeline she had witnessed with Marcus, she had approximately 2 hours before the erasure moved from digital to physical. 2 hours before men came to her apartment to complete the elimination process. Maya forced herself to breathe, to think through the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She grabbed the go-bag she had pre-packed weeks ago, the one contingency that her paranoia had insisted she maintain. Cash, burner phones, encrypted USB drives with copies of her evidence, though those drives were probably compromised now, the encryption keys already extracted through methods she could only imagine. She smoothed out the crumpled screenshot on her kitchen counter one final time, studying the geometric patterns that had started this entire nightmare. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it back into her jacket pocket, the only evidence she had left, and ran. She abandoned her car in a grocery store parking lot in Torrance, walking away from it with the keys still in the ignition, hoping someone would steal it and add one more layer of confusion to any tracking efforts. She took a bus to Inglewood, paid cash, kept her head down, and found a cash for cars lot that operated out of a garage that looked barely legal. The Honda Civic she bought was 15 years old, primer grey, with questionable registration, but an engine that ran. She paid $2,000 in 20s and drove away without paperwork, beyond a handwritten receipt that wouldn't survive any serious scrutiny. Maya used fake names, never the same one twice, rotating through identities she invented on the spot. Sarah Johnson, Emily Martinez, Rebecca Nguyen. She cut her hair short in a gas station bathroom at 3 in the morning, using kitchen scissors she bought from a dollar store, watching dark strands fall into the stained sink. The auburn dye came from a different drugstore. Applied in another gas station bathroom 2 days later, her reflection in the mirror slowly transforming into someone she didn't recognize. Maya Torres, mid-level systems analyst with sharp features and an MIT education, ceased to exist. In her place was a generic woman, forgettable and anonymous, the kind of person who moved through the world without leaving impressions or memories. Every stranger's glance felt like recognition, like surveillance, like the moment before someone pulled out a phone to report her location. She moved constantly, never sleeping in the same motel twice, paying for rooms and leaving in the middle of the night if something felt wrong. The something was usually nothing. A car engine starting at an odd hour, voices in the parking lot, the particular way a motel clerk looked at her, but she couldn't afford to ignore intuition when her life depended on staying ahead of people who had made Marcus and Daniel Reeves disappear without trace. Could she trust anyone in law enforcement, or would calling 911 just bring more people trying to erase her? She remembered Marcus's empty apartment, the professional thoroughness of the cleaning, the way his family had been coached to deliver scripted responses. That kind of operation required coordination across multiple jurisdictions, cooperation between agencies that normally competed for authority. The reach was far enough. That was all she needed to know. Desperation bred audacity, Maya had lost almost everything, but she still had one asset that the organization might not have fully neutralized: her technical knowledge and her familiarity with security systems from her years in aerospace. She still had one legacy credential, an access code from a third-party auditing contract she had worked 2 years ago, that might not have been purged from every system. It was a long shot, but long shots were all she had left. The Tesla factory in Fremont operated 24 hours a day, robots and skeleton crews maintaining production even during the graveyard shift. Maya arrived at 2 in the morning, parking the Honda 3 blocks away and walking to the employee entrance through industrial streets that were empty except for semi-trucks making deliveries. She wore a thrift store blazer over a button-down shirt, carrying a clipboard and a lanyard with a laminated ID card she had printed at a FedEx office using a photo editing program and a blank template she found online. The ID claimed she was Jennifer Walsh from Tech Audit Solutions, there for a surprise compliance inspection. It wouldn't survive detailed scrutiny, but at 2 in the morning, security guards were tired and looking for reasons not to escalate situations. The legacy credential worked on the first try, the security panel blinking green and unlocking with a click that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet night. Maya's heart hammered as she stepped through, nodding at the security guard monitoring the entrance with what she hoped was professional confidence. The guard glanced at her ID, glanced at his computer screen, and waved her through with the bored efficiency of someone who had processed 1,000 third-party contractors and didn't have the energy to care about one more. Battery packs moved along autonomous conveyors, being assembled by machines without human intervention, the entire production line operating like a vast organism that had transcended the need for human guidance. The scale was staggering, the precision inhuman. Maya moved through it with her clipboard held like a shield, looking like she belonged there, trying not to think about what would happen if someone asked her to explain exactly what she was auditing. She found the engineering terminals in a secured area behind glass walls, workstations where designers reviewed CAD models and system specifications. The access card from her fake ID shouldn't have worked here, but when she swiped it, the door unlocked. Either her forgery was better than she thought, or the organization was still allowing her some rope, watching to see where she would go and what she would try to access. Maya didn't have the luxury of caring which. She sat down at a terminal, logged in using a generic engineering account with a default password she had learned years ago during her auditing work, and started searching for battery architecture files. She studied the Tesla battery system with professional focus, following the pathways of current from individual cells through management boards to output terminals. The design was elegant, efficient, representing billions of dollars in research and development. But as she dug deeper into the subsystem architecture, Maya found components that didn't make sense. There were receiver circuits embedded in the battery management system, tiny arrays of crystalline structures that served no functional purpose by conventional electrical engineering standards. They didn't regulate voltage or manage temperature or balance cell discharge. They just sat there in the design, consuming negligible power, resonating at frequencies that didn't correspond to any standard electromagnetic spectrum. Maya cross-referenced them with antenna designs, with radio receivers, with exotic materials research. The structures were tuned receivers, designed to pick up signals that shouldn't exist, and feed that information into the vehicle's computer systems through channels that bypassed normal diagnostic protocols. The design was elegant, hidden in plain sight among thousands of other components, visible only if you knew what to look for and understood enough about both conventional and unconventional engineering to recognize the anomaly. It was utterly alien in origin, or at least inspired by intelligence that wasn't human. Every Tesla on the road was carrying receivers, antenna tuned to frequencies that the Anunnaki transmitted on, turning the entire electric vehicle fleet into a distributed network for purposes Maya couldn't even begin to guess at. This was the smoking gun that showed extraterrestrial technology embedded in consumer products, affecting millions of vehicles worldwide. Someone had noticed the anomalous login, or the terminal access patterns had triggered automated flags, or a human security monitor had finally looked closely at the camera feeds and realized that the woman at the engineering terminal wasn't Jennifer Walsh from Tech Audit Solutions. She had maybe 90 seconds before guards arrived with the authority to detain her and the resources to ensure she never left the building. She abandoned the terminal, still logged in, grabbed her phone and the USB drive, and sprinted for the exit. The factory floor that had seemed beautiful in its mechanical precision now felt like a maze of obstacles and dead ends. She dodged around robotic arms and conveyor systems, her thrift store shoes slipping on the polished concrete floor, the sound of running footsteps behind her driving her forward. She hit the emergency exit at full speed, the alarm shrieking as the door burst open, and kept running into the pre-dawn darkness of industrial Fremont. They didn't come, or at least not immediately, and Maya made it to a storage unit she had rented in Ontario using another fake name and another prepaid gift card. The unit was small, barely large enough for a few boxes, but it had electrical outlets and enough privacy that she could hide there for a few hours without being discovered. The transmission arrived unbidden while Maya was sitting on the concrete floor of the storage unit, her back against the corrugated metal wall, trying to decide what to do next. Her last remaining burner laptop powered on by itself, the screen glowing in the dim space, and the familiar interface materialized without her touching any keys. The Anunnaki voice spoke with that same layered harmonic cadence, but this time there was something that might have been urgency underlying the alien intonation. Only then will convergence occur. They wanted her, a fugitive systems analyst with no resources and every security agency probably hunting her, to somehow get close enough to one of the most protected and visible humans on the planet to speak a Sumerian phrase that would supposedly activate his role as an alien vessel. The absurdity was cosmic. It was insane. It was so far beyond her capabilities that she couldn't even begin to imagine how to attempt it. A SpaceX press event scheduled in 3 days at the Hawthorne facility, announcing some new development in the Starship program. Security protocols, timing, the layout of the venue, all provided in clinical detail, and the exact phrase in Sumerian, phonetically transcribed so she could pronounce it correctly. The alien intelligence had given her everything she needed to attempt the impossible, except the courage and the certainty that she wasn't being manipulated towards some end she couldn't comprehend. Speaking an alien phrase that might trigger anything from enlightenment to catastrophe. Every rational part of Maya's mind screamed that this was how the story ended, with her either arrested or eliminated or committed to psychiatric evaluation for attempting to speak Sumerian to a billionaire. If the Anunnaki were real, if the cultivation of human innovation was actually happening, then Elon Musk was the current focal point of that design. Activating him, whatever that meant, could expose the entire conspiracy in a way that couldn't be contained, or it could complete some alien agenda that would reshape human civilization in ways she couldn't predict. The alien contact's final words echoed in the small storage unit, spoken with something that almost sounded like compassion. Humanity's trajectory depends on this moment. You were chosen because you are alone. The alone see clearly. They see without the comfortable delusions of social consensus. They make decisions that connected people would never risk. They have nothing to lose except their lives, and lives without meaning are just biology waiting for termination. She had wanted significance, had craved it desperately enough to follow every breadcrumb of this investigation, past every warning and threat. Now she had a choice that was really no choice at all. Maya checked the time on her burner phone. She had 72 hours to prepare for something impossible, and no idea if she would survive long enough to attempt it. She was checking news feeds from a McDonald's Wi-Fi connection in San Bernardino when the first article appeared on a tech industry blog. Former Aerodyne Systems employee suffers apparent mental breakdown, makes wild conspiracy claims about Elon Musk and ancient aliens. The story had her name, her employment history, even a photograph from her MIT graduation that she couldn't remember being publicly accessible. The narrative was sympathetic in the most devastating way possible, painting her as a tragic figure rather than a dangerous one. She would fixate on patterns, see connections that weren't there. I tried to get her help, but she refused to admit there was a problem. I'm just glad she's getting the attention she needs now. The warning signs were there for months. The quotes had the ring of authenticity, probably because they had been carefully coached by handlers who understood exactly how to construct a believable narrative of mental decline. She was being discredited into irrelevance, transformed from a potential whistleblower into a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsessive thinking and social isolation. The organization's strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. No martyrdom that might inspire others to investigate. No missing persons case that could generate media attention. Just a sad story of a brilliant mind unraveling under pressure. A woman who had confused pattern recognition with conspiracy theory and lost her grip on reality in the process. People would shake their heads and move on, satisfied that the mystery was explained and contained. Photos of the Tesla factory schematics, printed on cheap paper at various FedEx office locations. Notes in her handwriting, analyses of the Sumerian tablet and its geometric correlations. The screenshot that had survived everything, now worn at the folds from being carried in her pocket for weeks. She stared at it all, this collection of data that had consumed her life and destroyed her identity, and for the first time since receiving that initial transmission, allowed herself to ask the forbidden question, what if I am crazy? Deepfake technology had advanced to the point where creating convincing alien voices wasn't technically impossible, just difficult. What if the patterns she had found were confirmation bias? Her brilliant analytical mind turned against her by loneliness and the desperate need for significance. She had wanted to matter so badly, had wanted to be chosen for something important so desperately that maybe she had constructed an entire conspiracy out of coincidental correlations and ambiguous data. Elon Musk's career timeline, aligning with ancient astronomical dates, could be selection bias, picking out the correlations that fit while ignoring the thousands of events that didn't. Every piece of evidence, examined with ruthless skepticism, had alternate explanations that didn't require ancient aliens cultivating human innovation. Maya looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, seeing a woman with badly dyed auburn hair and thrift store clothes 3 sizes too big, dark circles under her eyes from weeks of poor sleep and worse nutrition. She looked exactly like what the articles described, someone who had lost their way, whose brilliant mind had turned inward and consumed itself with paranoid fantasies. She had never felt more alone in her life, and the loneliness felt like vindication of every terrible thing the articles were saying about her. So she forced herself back into analytical mode, pushing aside the emotional weight of isolation and doubt, and revisited the evidence with the cold precision of someone conducting a peer review. She would approach this the way she would approach any scientific question: test the hypothesis, examine the data, calculate the probabilities. Kahale had included with the physical artifact before it was stolen. The battery receiver subsystems, those strange crystalline structures that served no conventional electrical purpose, followed a specific geometric pattern. Maya traced it with her finger, then traced the pattern carved into the ancient clay tablet. She pulled up a pattern-matching algorithm on her burner phone, photographed both images, and ran the comparison. Not similar, nearly identical within the margin of error that natural variation and measurement imprecision would create. The probability of two patterns achieving that level of correlation by random chance was functionally zero. Even accounting for confirmation bias, even assuming she was unconsciously selecting favorable data points, the statistical evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't delusion. The geometric pattern that Sumerian scribes carved into clay 4,000 years ago matched the receiver architecture in modern electric vehicles with a precision that exceeded anything random chance could produce. They had pushed her to the absolute edge of doubt, forced her to question everything, because only someone who had examined the evidence under maximal skepticism and still found it compelling would have the conviction necessary for what came next. The choice had never been about proof. Science dealt in probabilities, not certainties. Even Einstein's theories were technically unproven until experimental verification, and he moved forward based on mathematical elegance and internal consistency rather than absolute certainty. Did people have the right to understand that their greatest innovations might not be the product of human genius alone, but rather the result of cultivation by an intelligence that had been guiding development for millennia? And more personally, more honestly, was she doing this for truth or for herself? To matter, to be seen, to escape the suffocating mundanity of a life that had become mechanical and purposeless, to prove that her existence had significance beyond the ghost she had been for 5 years. If she was wrong, she would be arrested, possibly committed, certainly destroyed as a credible person. If she was right, everything would change. Either way, she would matter. She would be seen. And that was worth whatever consequences followed. The public demonstration of the new Starship engine test had drawn hundreds of people, media with professional cameras, investors in expensive suits, employees who had worked on the project and wanted to witness their labor validated. The observation deck was packed, everyone jockeying for position to get the best view of the test firing scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. Maya used a legacy credential that she had found buried in a subsidiary database during one of her desperate searches for access that hadn't been revoked. The credential belonged to a logistics contractor that had gone bankrupt 6 months ago, its database entries still present in the system because someone in IT hadn't completed the cleanup process. She had created a fake ID card using the company name and her own photo, laminated it at an office supply store, and prayed that security wouldn't look too closely at a credential from a defunct vendor. Maya moved through the facility with her hood up and her face down, clutching a laminated card she had made that morning. The card contained the Sumerian phrase spelled phonetically Enanatuma Zishagal Shumu Bi. She had practiced the pronunciation for hours, playing audio recordings from academic linguistic sources, repeating it until the alien syllables felt natural in her mouth. Security was omnipresent, serious men and women with earpieces and the posture of people who knew how to use force efficiently. But crowds provided cover, and Maya positioned herself near the VIP section where Elon Musk would be watching the demonstration. She had studied the layout from satellite imagery and facility maps, had memorized the likely paths he would take from the observation deck to the backstage area. She had one chance, maybe seconds, to speak to him before security removed her. Everything depended on timing and luck and the hope that the Anunnaki transmission had been telling the truth about what would happen. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, everyone recording with their phones, capturing the moment when theoretical engineering became physical reality. Elon Musk stood at the front of the VIP section, watching with the slight smile of someone who saw the universe bending to his will through sheer force of vision and resources. He looked smaller in person than Maya had expected, more human, though the aura of significance around him was undeniable. The transmission arrived in her mind, rather than through any device, a sensation that was distinctly alien and impossible to describe in conventional sensory terms. The Anunnaki voice spoke with crystalline clarity. "Speak when his eyes meet yours." The phrase will trigger subconscious recognition. The vessel will remember. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs so violently she thought people around her might hear it. This was insanity. This was necessity. The two states existed simultaneously. Quantum superposition of possibility, collapsing into a single, decisive action. Maya stepped forward, pushing through the crowd with the kind of aggressive confidence that made people move instinctively aside, blocking Musk's path directly in front of his security detail. Hands reached for her, bodies moving to intercept, but Maya was already speaking, the Sumerian phrase emerging from her mouth with surprising clarity. "Enanatuma zishagal shumubi." The ancient words hung in the air between them, syllables that hadn't been spoken in thousands of years, now delivered to one of the most powerful humans alive. A flicker, barely perceptible microsecond recognition that crossed his face before conscious thought could process it. His eyes met Maya's, and in that instant, she saw something that might have been awakening or might have been ordinary curiosity. He held up a hand to his security detail, the gesture casual but absolute in its authority. "Wait, what did you say?" She spoke rapidly, words tumbling out in a compressed summary of months of investigation. "Your funding sources, Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink. Your timeline aligns with Sumerian astronomical dates. The battery architecture contains receiver subsystems that have no conventional electrical purpose. You're not choosing your path, you're executing a program that was designed 4,000 years ago by the Anunnaki. You're a vessel. You've been cultivated." His expression was unreadable, that famous intensity focused completely on the document in his hands. He studied it for what felt like an eternity, but was probably 15 seconds. Long enough that his handlers started shifting uncomfortably, and security began closing in again despite his earlier command. When he looked up, his face gave nothing away. The response was maddeningly ambiguous, delivered with the kind of calculated neutrality that could mean anything or nothing. "I'll look into it." She was escorted out of the facility with efficient speed, placed in a security office, detained while someone made calls and checked databases, and determined what exactly to do with the woman who had confronted Elon Musk with ancient Sumerian phrases and conspiracy theories about alien cultivation of human innovation. Maya sat in a plastic chair, hands trembling with adrenaline crash, and waited for whatever came next. 6 months later, Maya sat in a small apartment in Santa Fe, New Mexico, watching the desert sun paint the mountains in shades of amber and gold. The apartment was modest but comfortable, a one-bedroom in a complex that catered to remote workers and artists seeking isolation. The charges from the SpaceX incident had been dropped mysteriously after 2 weeks of legal limbo. No explanation was provided. Just a notice from the district attorney's office stating that prosecution was not being pursued at this time. Her credentials at Aerodyne Systems were restored, her accounts unfrozen, her digital identity rebuilt as if the erasure had never happened. An unknown tech research firm called Threshold Analytics, offering her a position as a senior signal processing consultant with a salary that was double what she had made at Aerodyne. Remote work, flexible hours, no questions asked about her employment gap or the reasons for her departure from aerospace. The offer letter had been professionally vague about the firm's actual purpose, mentioning only advanced research into communication systems and pattern recognition. Maya had accepted because she needed income and because turning down an offer that generous would itself be suspicious. He announced a revolutionary energy project that would redefine humanity's understanding of physics, something about quantum field interactions and zero-point energy extraction. The technical details were intentionally vague, promises rather than specifications, but during the presentation, he flashed design schematics on the screen behind him. The images were visible for maybe 3 seconds before transitioning to the next slide, but Maya paused the video and studied the frozen frame. Either Musk had investigated her claims and found them compelling enough to incorporate into his research, or he had always been working toward this, and her intervention had simply accelerated the timeline. She would never know which. Maya didn't need to translate it to understand the meaning, though she did anyway, using the linguistic databases she had maintained. Convergence complete. Observation continues. Those stars had witnessed the rise and fall of Sumerian civilization, had looked down on the ancient scribes carving patterns into clay tablets, had watched humanity stumble and climb its way towards spaceflight and electric vehicles and artificial intelligence. Whether that trajectory was natural evolution or guided cultivation didn't change the immensity of the cosmos or the insignificance of individual human lives within it. That much was certain. She had mattered, had affected events in ways that might ripple forward for generations or might dissolve into meaningless noise within months. She was a player in a game whose rules she would never fully understand, whose winners and losers might not be determined until humanity either reached the stars or destroyed itself trying. She didn't know if she had saved humanity or doomed it, if exposing Musk to his role had been liberation or acceleration toward some alien agenda she couldn't comprehend. She might be a pawn or a prophet, a victim or a collaborator, but she was no longer invisible. She was seen by powers that existed beyond human understanding, and that recognition gave her life the significance she had craved, even if she could never be certain what that significance meant. Tomorrow she would log in to her mysterious remote job and process whatever signals and patterns threshold analytics sent her way. She would live in uncertainty, suspended between conspiracy and clarity, never knowing if she was still being manipulated or had achieved some form of agency. The alone see clearly, the Anunnaki had told her. But clarity, she had learned, was not the same as understanding. It was simply the absence of comforting delusions, the willingness to stare at ambiguity without demanding resolution. The answer, if it existed at all, belonged to the vast intelligence that had selected her for reasons she could only guess at, and whose ultimate purpose remained as incomprehensible as the dark between the stars. She had been living there for 6 months now, consulting remotely for Threshold Analytics, the mysterious tech firm that paid her generously to analyze signal patterns from deep space telescopes and communications satellites. The work was fascinating in ways that her old job at Aerodyne had never been. Complex enough to engage her analytical mind, but ambiguous enough that she never quite understood what larger purpose her analyses served. Her apartment had changed in small but significant ways. Plants lined the windowsills now, not the dying succulent from her old desk, but thriving specimens that she actually watered and fed with nutrients. A pothos vine cascaded from a hanging planter near the kitchen, its leaves glossy and vigorous. Jade plants clustered on the balcony, soaking up the intense New Mexico sun. Taking care of living things required a level of engagement with the present moment that Maya had avoided for years, but now she found the ritual comforting. The plants grew regardless of alien conspiracies or government surveillance. They existed in simple biological terms, seeking light and water, and that simplicity was its own kind of truth. The members were a mix of serious amateur astronomers with expensive equipment and curious newcomers who just wanted to look at Saturn's rings through a telescope. Maya attended as Sarah Williams, using one of the fake names she had adopted during her fugitive period, though she suspected that if anyone was still monitoring her, they knew exactly where she was and who she was pretending to be. But the astronomy club offered something she hadn't experienced in years: human connection without the weight of her history. She drank terrible coffee from a community college cafeteria and listened to people talk about their lives with the comfortable assumption that the universe operated according to known physical laws and human achievement was the product of human effort alone. She didn't correct them. She didn't share what she knew about Sumerian cultivation programs and receiver architectures hidden in consumer electronics. She just listened and participated and pretended for a few hours each month that she could be normal again. The bag sat there like a monument to paranoia, a physical reminder that her new life existed at the pleasure of forces that could revoke it at any moment. Maya checked it weekly, replacing perishable items, updating the encrypted drives, making sure the cache hadn't been stolen or spontaneously combusted or whatever irrational fate her paranoid mind imagined. The cars that had followed her during those desperate weeks had disappeared. Her phone no longer showed the telltale echo of interception. Her internet traffic seemed clean, though she still used VPNs and encrypted communication out of habit rather than necessity. Either the organization had decided she was no longer a threat, or they had transitioned to monitoring methods that were beyond her ability to detect. She suspected the latter. Once you became interesting to entities with effectively unlimited resources, you never really stopped being interesting. You just became a lower priority, background surveillance instead of active suppression. The rogue archaeologist had resumed her research, funded by anonymous grants that she didn't question, because questioning would mean losing access to resources she had been denied for decades. She was excavating a new site in Turkey, finding artifacts that supported her theories about ancient technological knowledge, publishing papers through obscure academic journals that mainstream institutions ignored. Her emails were carefully worded, never explicitly referencing the Anunnaki or the conspiracy, but the subtext was clear. The work continued. The pattern persisted. The images looked real enough, but Maya had seen how thoroughly the organization could fabricate digital identities. She didn't believe Marcus was voluntarily traveling through Europe. She believed he was either deep in a protection program that had erased his previous existence, or he was dead and the Facebook account was puppet theater for anyone checking. She would never know which. She'd learned to live with uncertainty, the way other people lived with chronic pain. A constant presence that you adapted to because the alternative was paralysis. Technology companies announced new products. Politicians made promises they wouldn't keep. Celebrities generated controversies that dominated news cycles before evaporating into irrelevance. The surface of human civilization continued its chaotic pattern of progress and regression, advancement and catastrophe, exactly as it had for thousands of years. But Maya saw the scaffolding beneath now, the possibility that all of it was a gardening project tended by ancient intelligences with motivations she could only guess at. Every breakthrough in artificial intelligence or quantum computing made her ask if the insight had come from human genius or from cultivation systems that had been running since Sumerian scribes carved their first tablets. The pattern was everywhere, once you knew to look for it, and knowing meant you could never return to comfortable ignorance. Maya stood on her balcony at night with a telescope she had bought from a local astronomy shop, pointed at the stars that scattered across the desert sky with a density impossible to see in urban environments. The light pollution in Santa Fe was minimal compared to Los Angeles, and on clear nights the Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, billions of stars whose photons had traveled for millennia to reach her eyes. She thought about the ordinary people below, visible through their lit windows in the apartment complex, driving home from late shifts, watching television, living their lives in comfortable ignorance of cultivated trajectories and alien agendas. They made plans for the future with the reasonable expectation that their agency was real rather than an illusion granted by entities beyond comprehension. They lived in the world as it appeared, rather than as it might actually be, and that ignorance protected them from the burden of questions without answers. They thought their choices were free, but if the Anunnaki were real, if human progress was actually a gardening project, then their freedom was the freedom of plants growing in carefully tended soil. They were reaching toward the sun, because that's what plants do, unaware that the garden had been designed and the nutrients had been provided, and the entire ecosystem existed to produce a specific harvest. To live in ignorance of the forces shaping your life, or to know about them and understand your powerlessness to resist. Maya had chosen knowledge with all its costs. Isolation that went beyond physical loneliness into existential separation from humanity, paranoia that made every interaction suspect, the burden of questions that couldn't be answered, and truths that couldn't be shared. But she had also chosen significance. She mattered in a story larger than herself, had affected events in ways that might ripple forward for generations. The price was the comfort of certainty. The reward was agency, even if that agency might be an illusion, granted by the same entities whose patterns she thought she was disrupting. She would never know if she had been manipulated or liberated, if speaking that Sumerian phrase to Elon Musk had changed anything or simply fulfilled some predetermined role in a script written millennia ago. The ambiguity was permanent, irreducible, and she had learned to carry it the way monks carried vows. It defined her relationship to reality. It made her who she was now, distinct from who she had been as a ghost in her own life, going through routines without meaning or purpose. Maya opened it carefully in her kitchen, half expecting something dangerous, but finding only another clay tablet fragment wrapped in archival plastic. The imagery carved into its surface depicted figures descending from the sky, teaching humans something that the accompanying text labeled in archaic Sumerian as reaching the sky ocean. Maya translated it using her linguistic databases, recognizing the ancient term that modern scholars interpreted as space or the cosmos. The figures were teaching humans to reach space, showing them architectural designs and geometric patterns that looked disturbingly like rocket engine schematics. She placed the tablet on her shelf next to the thriving jade plants, the ancient clay and the living green, creating a juxtaposition that felt meaningful even if she couldn't articulate exactly how. The technical challenges had been solved faster than expected, he claimed. New propulsion systems, new life support architectures, new materials that could withstand the radiation of deep space better than anything previously developed. He flashed schematics during the presentation, complex engineering diagrams that the audience applauded even though most of them probably couldn't interpret the technical details. The receiver subsystems were there again, more elaborate now, integrated into the propulsion architecture in ways that served no conventional engineering purpose. The geometric patterns matched the tablet sitting on her shelf with the kind of precision that couldn't be coincidental. Phase 2 was initiating exactly as the anonymous note had warned, and she was watching it unfold in real time through a corporate press conference that the world interpreted as innovation, but that Maya understood as cultivation. She was infrastructure now, a component in whatever machinery the Anunnaki had constructed. They had selected her, tested her, pushed her to the edge of doubt, and then reintegrated her into the system with full knowledge of what she was participating in. Whether that made her a willing collaborator or a sophisticated prisoner was a question without meaningful distinction. The alien contact's words echoed in her memory with the clarity of recent trauma. You were chosen because you are alone. But she wasn't entirely alone anymore. She had her plants and her astronomy club and her mysterious remote job that let her analyze the same deep space signals that might be carrying Anunnaki transmissions. She had Dr. Kahale somewhere in Turkey, excavating evidence that mainstream academia would continue to ignore. She had the possibility, never confirmed but never disproven, that Marcus was alive somewhere and aware of what was happening. She had the community of people who had glimpsed the scaffolding beneath reality and could never unsee it, scattered across the world, connected by knowledge that isolated them from everyone else. She was part of something vast and terrifying and magnificent, a story that stretched from Sumerian clay tablets to Mars colonization timelines, from ancient cultivators who descended from the sky to modern billionaires who thought they were choosing their own paths. The story didn't end, it didn't resolve. It recursed, layered, expanded into dimensions that human consciousness couldn't fully map. Endings were for narratives with boundaries and limitations. This was bigger than narrative. This was the structure of history itself, revealed as less like a river flowing naturally toward the ocean and more like a canal, excavated and directed by intelligences with plans that operated on timescales that made human lifespans look like mayfly existence. Maya smiled at the stars visible through her apartment window, the same stars that Sumerian priests had tracked and mapped and encoded into clay tablets that modern systems analysts would decipher thousands of years later. The stars didn't smile back. They didn't need to. They had been there when the Anunnaki first visited Earth, if that's what had actually happened. They would be there when humanity reached Mars and beyond, if that's what the cultivation was directing toward. They would be there when the final phase of whatever design was unfolding finally completed, or when humanity failed to complete it and was discarded like an unsuccessful experiment. Human concerns about freedom and agency and purpose were provincial, limited by consciousness that had evolved to solve practical problems of survival rather than to comprehend its own context. She would never know the truth. She would never understand the full design. She would participate in Phase 2 because that's what her role demanded, analyzing signals and maintaining readiness and watching for the next transmission that would arrive when the cultivators decided she needed new instructions. They just continue, adding chapters, encompassing new characters, expanding until the original beginning is lost in the distance and the eventual ending exists somewhere beyond the horizon of comprehension. Maya Torres, who had started as a ghost trying to escape mundanity, had become infrastructure in a cosmic narrative. She mattered now. She had significance. Whether that significance served human flourishing or alien agenda was a question she couldn't answer and had stopped trying to. She would water her plants and attend her astronomy club and live her life in the space between knowledge and ignorance, awareness and action, freedom and cultivation. The stars would continue their ancient patterns. The conspiracy would continue unfolding. And Maya would stand ready for Phase 2, whatever that meant, because she had been chosen and she had chosen, and in that mutual selection was the only meaning she could access. The desert night embraced Santa Fe with its vast silence. Somewhere in Los Angeles, Elon Musk was planning missions to Mars. Somewhere in Turkey, Dr. Cahill was excavating proof that would be systematically ignored. Somewhere in the space between human understanding and alien intention, the Anunnaki watched and waited, and continued their cultivation project with patience that spanned millennia. And in a small apartment that smelled of earth and growing things, Maya Torres slept without nightmares for the first time in a year, having finally accepted that uncertainty was the only certainty she would ever possess. And that was enough.